Sometimes, the ones buried in silence aren't lost, they're waiting for someone who still knows how to listen. The wind came low and steady that morning, dragging long whispers through the pines as if the forest itself was remembering something it hadn't spoken in years, and Caleb Dawson stood just outside his cabin, one gloved hand resting against the rough wooden frame, watching the horizon disappear beneath a slow curtain of falling snow, the kind that softened everything it touched until the world felt quieter, heavier, like a breath held too long, and beside him, Rex shifted, his paws pressing into the fresh powder with a tension that didn't belong to the cold, his ears tilted forward, body rigid, listening to something far beyond the reach of human hearing, and Caleb noticed it the way he always did, not with alarm, but with a quiet understanding that came from years of trusting the dog more than his own instincts. "What is it, boy?" he murmured, his voice barely louder than the wind, but Rex didn't look back, didn't move toward him like he usually would. Instead he stepped forward, one slow step at a time, his nose low to the ground, tracing an invisible path through the snow as if something beneath it was calling out in a language only he could hear. And then it happened, sudden and sharp. Rex bolted, cutting through the drifts with a force that sent powder into the air behind him, disappearing between the trees without hesitation, and Caleb's heart tightened, not with fear, but with that familiar pull, the one that had followed him through war and silence alike. The sense that something had shifted, something important. He grabbed his coat tighter and followed, boots sinking nearly 6 inches into the fresh snow with every step, his breath rising in short clouds as the forest closed around him, the world narrowing to the sound of his footsteps and the distant crunch of Rex ahead, deeper into the woods than they ever needed to go, deeper than most people would dare this time of year, the cold biting sharper with every yard. And then the barking started, not frantic, not wild, but measured, deliberate, 3 short bursts that echoed through the trees and stopped just as quickly as they began. Caleb froze for a second, counting without meaning to, the old habit still living somewhere in his bones. 3, always 3. Rex only did that when something mattered, when it wasn't just curiosity, but certainty. "I'm coming," he said under his breath, pushing forward faster now, branches scraping against his jacket, the wind cutting sideways through the clearing ahead, and when he broke through the last line of trees, he saw him, Rex, standing still. Completely still, his body squared toward a patch of uneven snow, his head lowered, one paw pressed gently against the ground as if holding something in place, not digging anymore, just waiting, watching, and Caleb slowed as he approached. Something in the air shifting again, the silence deeper here, heavier, like the world itself had paused. He dropped to one knee beside the dog, brushing away the snow with gloved hands, the cold seeping through instantly, biting into his skin, but he didn't stop, not even when his fingers hit fabric, not even when the shape beneath the snow became clearer, human, still, a pale face barely visible beneath a thin layer of frost and drifting white, a woman, motionless, her breath too faint to see, and for a moment, just a moment, the forest seemed to hold its breath with him. Caleb leaned closer, pressing 2 fingers gently against her neck, waiting, listening, and then, there it was, faint, fragile, but real, a pulse, slow and stubborn, like it refused to disappear completely. He exhaled, something inside his chest loosening just enough to move again. "She's alive," he whispered, more to Rex than to himself, and the dog let out a low sound, not quite a bark, not quite a whine, something older, something that felt almost like relief. And as Caleb carefully cleared more snow from her shoulders, something caught his eye, a thin silver chain resting against her collarbone, barely visible beneath the ice. He brushed it free, revealing a small pendant, worn with age, engraved with a name he couldn't quite read through the frost, but something about it felt familiar, not in memory, but in feeling, like a word on the tip of his tongue he hadn't spoken in years. And the wind shifted again, softer this time, almost like a sigh, moving through the trees above them as Caleb gathered the woman into his arms, her weight lighter than he expected, fragile, as if the cold had already begun to take more than just her warmth, and Rex stepped close, pressing against his side, ready to lead the way back without needing to be told, because somehow, he already knew this wasn't just a rescue, it was the beginning of something that had been waiting a long time to be found. The walk back felt longer than it should have, as if the forest itself had stretched the distance, each step sinking deep into the snow while the wind pressed cold fingers through Caleb's coat, yet he did not slow, not with the faint rhythm of the woman's breathing brushing against his chest, fragile but present, a quiet reminder that time mattered in ways the storm did not care about, and Rex stayed close at his side, no longer running ahead but moving in a steady line, glancing back every few steps to make sure Caleb followed the exact path he had chosen, as if even a single wrong turn might cost something that could not be returned, and the trees whispered overhead, their branches shifting with a low creak that sounded almost like an old memory being stirred. And Caleb felt it then, that strange pull again, deeper now, heavier, not fear, not quite urgency, but something in between, something that told him this moment did not begin in the snow and would not end when they reached the cabin. And when the outline of the cabin finally appeared through the drifting white, its small windows dim and waiting, Caleb pushed the door open with his shoulder and stepped inside, the sudden stillness wrapping around them like a held breath finally released. He laid the woman gently on the worn couch near the fireplace, her skin pale against the rough fabric, her clothes stiff with cold, and without hesitation he moved, his hands working with the quiet precision of habit, striking a match, feeding the fire, coaxing the flames back to life until the room filled with a soft orange glow that flickered against the walls, warming the space inch by inch, and Rex took his place beside the couch, sitting close enough that his body nearly touched hers, his eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that did not waver, as if he were guarding something more than a life, as if he were waiting for something to return. And Caleb knelt beside her, removing his gloves, his fingers brushing against her wrist again, counting, steady but slow. Then he reached for a blanket and wrapped it carefully around her shoulders, his movements gentle, deliberate, the way one handles something fragile, not because it might break, but because it already had, somewhere unseen. And as the fire grew stronger, the quiet inside the cabin deepened, broken only by the soft crackle of wood and the distant sigh of wind against the walls. Caleb noticed the pendant again, now clearer in the warmth, the frost melting away to reveal its worn surface. He leaned closer, squinting slightly, and the name came into focus, etched in small, careful letters, Eleanor. The words settled into the air between breaths, unfamiliar yet somehow weighted, like a name carried for a long time without being spoken aloud, and Rex shifted slightly, letting out a low, almost inaudible sound, his ears twitching as if reacting not to the room, but to something just beyond it. Caleb glanced at him, reading the dog the way he always had, not through commands, but through silence, and there it was again, that sense, that something unseen had followed them out of the forest and into this small space, not as a threat, but as a presence waiting to be understood. He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair, the warmth of the fire beginning to reach his skin, but not yet his thoughts. And then, just as the flames settled into a steady rhythm, the woman's fingers moved, barely noticeable at first, a slight tremor beneath the blanket, but enough to shift the air, enough for Rex to lean forward, his body tensing, his eyes sharpening with focus, and Caleb leaned in closer, his voice low, steady. "You are safe now," he said, though he was not entirely sure who the words were meant for. Her breathing changed, just slightly, deeper now, as if something inside her had begun to wake, and outside, the wind softened, the storm easing into a quieter hush, as if the world itself had decided to wait. The fire had settled into a steady glow, its warmth slowly reclaiming the edges of the room, and Caleb sat close enough to feel it on his hands while the rest of him still carried the cold from the forest, a quiet reminder that not everything thaws at the same pace. And across from him, the woman's breathing had grown deeper, more certain, each breath a small step back from whatever silence had nearly taken her, and Rex had not moved from her side, his body low, ears shifting with every subtle change, as if he were listening not only to her but to something layered beneath her presence, something older, something patient. And Caleb noticed it again, the way the dog's attention was not just protective but expectant, like he was waiting for a moment that had not yet arrived. And then the woman stirred more fully, her head turning slightly against the pillow, her brow tightening as if she were pulling herself through something heavy and unseen, and Caleb leaned forward, his voice calm. "Steady, you are safe," he said again, softer this time, and her eyes opened, slow at first, unfocused, catching the firelight in a way that made them seem almost distant, like she had not quite returned all the way yet. And for a few seconds she said nothing, just breathed, her gaze moving across the ceiling, the walls, the flicker of light, until it landed on Rex, and something shifted, not fear, not confusion, but recognition, quiet and deep, and her lips parted slightly as if to speak, but no sound came, only a faint breath that carried something close to a name, and Rex responded instantly, lifting his head, his tail moving once, slow and deliberate, a gesture Caleb had learned meant more than simple comfort. It meant the dog understood something without needing it explained, and Caleb felt that same strange pull tighten again in his chest, the sense that this moment was not random, not an accident of snow and chance, but something that had been set in motion long before either of them had stepped into the forest, and he reached for a cup of warm water, holding it near her lips, helping her take a small sip, her hands trembling slightly as they brushed against his, cold still lingering in her skin, but life returning in quiet, stubborn ways, and when she finally spoke, her voice was thin, fragile, yet clear enough to carry meaning. "You found me," she whispered, the words barely more than breath, but they settled into the room with a weight that made Caleb pause, because it did not sound like surprise, it sounded like certainty, like she had expected this outcome even as the storm closed around her, and he glanced at Rex again, then back at her. "My dog did," he replied gently, but she shook her head, just once, slow, deliberate, her eyes never leaving the dog. "No," she said softly, "he knew." And the way she said it made the air feel different, heavier, as if something unspoken had just stepped closer to the surface, and Caleb exhaled, leaning back slightly, his mind searching for something familiar in her words, but finding only fragments, a feeling without a clear shape, and then her hand moved weakly toward her neck, fingers brushing the pendant as if drawn to it by instinct, and Caleb followed the motion, watching as she curled her hand around it, holding it close for a moment before looking back at him, her eyes clearer now, sharper, carrying something beneath the exhaustion, something that felt like purpose. "How long?" she asked quietly, and Caleb glanced toward the window, where the snow had begun to ease into a lighter fall, the storm loosening its grip on the world outside. "Not long," he answered, "you were out there just before the worst of it passed," and she nodded faintly, as if that confirmed something she already knew, her gaze drifting again, not lost, but searching, as if measuring the space between what had happened and what still needed to happen, and Rex shifted closer, pressing his head gently against her hand, a simple gesture, yet filled with a kind of understanding that went beyond training, beyond instinct, and Caleb watched them in silence, the fire crackling softly between breaths, the cabin holding a quiet that felt less empty now, and more like a place where something long forgotten had finally found its way back, even if no one in the room could yet fully explain why. The warmth of the cabin began to settle deeper into the bones of the room, softening the sharp edges left behind by the storm, and Caleb remained seated nearby, his elbows resting lightly on his knees, watching the woman as if she might disappear again if he looked away for too long, while Rex stayed close, his presence steady, almost anchored, like a silent promise that whatever had been found would not be lost again. And the woman, Eleanor, drew in a slower breath, her chest rising with more strength now, her eyes no longer drifting but focusing, holding onto the world around her with quiet determination, and for a moment, none of them spoke, the fire filling the silence with a gentle rhythm, the kind that made time feel less urgent, more patient. And then Eleanor shifted slightly, her fingers tightening around the pendant as if it carried more than memory, as if it held something she had carried through years rather than miles, and when she finally spoke again, her voice was still soft, but steadier. "I was not lost," she said, and Caleb tilted his head slightly, not interrupting, allowing the words to come in their own time, and she looked toward the window, where the snow now fell in lighter, slower patterns. "I was following something," she continued, her gaze distant but clear, "something I could not explain, only feel," and Rex lifted his head at that, his ears turning forward, as if the words themselves had a sound only he could hear, and Caleb leaned back slightly, his brow tightening with a quiet curiosity that did not push, only waited, and Eleanor turned her attention back to him, studying his face with an intensity that felt strangely familiar, though they had never met. "You live here alone," she said, not as a question, but as a simple truth, and Caleb gave a small nod, his voice calm. "Just me and him," and Rex's tail moved once at the sound of his inclusion, and Eleanor's lips curved faintly, not quite a smile, but something close to recognition. "That is why it led me here," she whispered, her hand resting lightly against the dog's head, and Caleb felt that same quiet unease. Return, not fear, but the sense of something unfolding beyond his understanding, and he exhaled slowly, choosing his words carefully. "The storm would have taken you if he had not found you," he said, but Eleanor shook her head again, gently, as if correcting something deeper than the moment. "No," she replied, her voice carrying a quiet certainty. "The storm brought me where I needed to be," and the way she said it settled into the room like a truth that did not need proof, and Caleb looked down briefly, his hand brushing against the worn fabric of his sleeve, the old habits of questioning and doubt rising for a moment before fading again, because something in her presence made arguing feel unnecessary. And outside, the wind eased further, the world beyond the cabin growing still in a way that felt almost intentional, as if the storm had finished its work and stepped aside, and Eleanor's eyes softened as she looked at the fire, the reflection dancing in them like distant memories. "There was a man," she said quietly, "many years ago," and Caleb felt something tighten in his chest without knowing why, a faint echo of something long buried stirring beneath the surface. "He saved someone I loved," she continued, her voice steady but carrying a weight that had not lessened with time. "He did not stay, did not ask for anything, just left," and Rex shifted slightly, pressing closer, his presence grounding the moment as it deepened, and Caleb's gaze moved slowly back to her. His expression unreadable, yet something behind it had begun to change, something subtle but undeniable, and Eleanor met his eyes fully now, no longer searching, no longer uncertain. "I have been looking for him," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "for a very long time," and the fire cracked softly between them, the sound small but clear, like a quiet signal that something important had just been set in motion, and Caleb did not respond right away, because somewhere between her words and the silence that followed, he began to feel it, that this was not just a story being told, but a truth slowly making its way to the surface, one that neither of them could stop now, even if they wanted 2. Caleb did not speak for a long moment, not because he did not have words, but because something in Eleanor's voice had reached past the surface and settled somewhere deeper, a place he had spent years keeping quiet, and he stared into the fire as if the answer might rise from the embers themselves. But all he saw were fragments, pieces of memory that refused to come together all at once, and Rex shifted beside Eleanor, his gaze moving slowly between them, alert, patient, as though he understood that whatever was about to be said mattered in ways neither human fully grasped yet, and Eleanor drew in a careful breath, her fingers still wrapped around the pendant, her thumb brushing over its worn edges in a motion that felt practiced, almost ritual. "It was during a winter like this," she continued softly, her eyes drifting toward the window where the snow had nearly stopped, leaving behind a pale, quiet world. The roads were gone, the town cut off, and everything felt uncertain, and her voice carried no panic, only memory, steady and clear despite the years it had traveled. "My son was there," she said, and Caleb felt that word land differently than the rest, heavier, anchored in something that did not fade. He was not supposed to be. But life does not always follow the plans we make, and she paused briefly, not to gather herself, but as if giving the moment the space it deserved, and Rex lowered his head slightly, his ears still attentive, his body calm but ready, and Caleb finally looked up, his eyes narrowing just slightly, not in doubt, but in recognition of something just out of reach. "There was an accident," Eleanor continued, her voice softening, "not loud, not sudden. Just the kind that leaves a man alone in the cold with no one to call," and Caleb's hand tightened slightly against his knee, the memory brushing closer now, not clear, but present, like a shape moving beneath still water. "He told me later," she said, "that he thought it was the end, that the silence had already begun to close around him," and she looked at Caleb again, her gaze steady, searching not for confirmation, but for truth. "And then someone found him," she whispered, and the fire cracked gently between them, a small sound that seemed louder than it should have been. "A man who did not ask questions, who did not hesitate, who simply stayed," and Caleb's breath slowed, his chest rising just slightly as the memory shifted again. This time closer, clearer, the outline beginning to form. A night, a storm, a shape in the snow, and he exhaled quietly, not yet ready to speak, but no longer able to pretend the connection was not there, and Eleanor watched him carefully. Her expression calm, patient, as if she had expected this moment to unfold exactly this way. "He carried him out," she said, her voice steady, "kept him alive through the night, and when the morning came, he was gone, and Caleb's eyes dropped briefly, his mind tracing the edges of something he had long buried beneath years of silence, something he had never thought would return. My son never knew his name, Eleanor continued, but he never forgot his face, and Rex lifted his head slightly at that, his eyes moving to Caleb, holding there for a second longer than usual, and something in that look made Caleb shift, not uncomfortably, but as if he were being seen in a way he had not allowed for a long time. And Eleanor leaned back slightly against the couch, her strength returning in quiet increments. Before he passed, she said, her voice soft but unwavering, he asked me to find that man, and Caleb closed his eyes for a brief moment, the memory finally breaking through, not as a single image, but as a feeling, a cold night, a promise unspoken, a life held together just long enough to continue. And when he opened his eyes again, the firelight reflected differently now, not just warmth, but recognition. And Eleanor met his gaze fully, no longer searching, no longer uncertain. I have followed that memory for years, she said quietly, through places that no longer exist, through names that led nowhere. And Rex moved closer, resting his head gently against Caleb's leg, grounding him in the present, until something changed, she added, her voice lowering just slightly, until something called me here, and the room fell still again, not empty, but full of something waiting, something just on the edge of being understood. And Caleb felt it clearly now, that this was no longer a story being told, it was a truth arriving, step by step, breath by breath, and there was no turning away from it anymore. Caleb remained still after her last words, the silence between them no longer empty but filled with something undeniable, something that had finally taken shape, and he let out a slow breath, his gaze drifting toward the fire as if searching for a place to set the weight of what he now understood, because the memory had come back, not in fragments anymore, but whole, clear, and impossible to ignore. A night years ago when the cold had felt just like this, when the snow had fallen without sound, and the world had narrowed to a single purpose. He could see it now, the shape of a man in the distance, barely moving, barely holding on, and he remembered the way his body had moved without hesitation, the way his hands had worked through the cold, steady and certain, not thinking about names or futures, only about keeping a stranger alive through one more hour, one more breath. And he had never stayed long enough to be known, never asked who the man was or where he came from, because back then, leaving had felt easier than staying, and now, sitting here, he understood that some moments do not end when we walk away from them, they wait, quietly, until they find their way back. And he finally looked up at Eleanor, his eyes no longer guarded, but carrying something deeper, something close to acceptance. I remember, he said, his voice low but steady, and the words settled into the room like something long overdue, and Eleanor's expression softened, not with surprise, but with a quiet relief that seemed to reach beyond the present moment, as if a path she had walked for years had finally led her exactly where it was meant to. And Rex shifted slightly between them, his tail brushing once against the floor, a small, grounded movement that felt like confirmation rather than reaction, and Eleanor nodded slowly, her fingers still resting against the pendant. He told me you would not remember his name, she said gently, but that you would remember the night. And Caleb gave the faintest hint of a smile, not from happiness, but from recognition, because that was true. The details of who the man had been had faded long ago, but the feeling of that night, the weight of it, had never fully left him. It had simply settled deeper over time, waiting for a reason to rise again. And the firelight flickered softly across the room, casting shadows that moved like quiet echoes along the walls, and for a moment everything felt still, as if the world outside had paused to allow this moment to unfold without interruption. And then Eleanor reached slowly into the inside of her coat, her movements careful but purposeful, and Caleb watched without speaking as she withdrew a small, worn envelope, its edges softened by time, its surface marked by the kind of wear that only comes from being carried for years, and she held it out toward him, her hand steady despite everything she had endured. He asked me to give this to you, she said, her voice calm, but carrying a weight that could not be measured in words. And Caleb hesitated for just a second, not out of doubt, but because he understood that whatever was inside that envelope did not belong to the past alone, it belonged to this moment, to everything that had led them here. And he reached forward, taking it gently, his fingers brushing against hers for the briefest instant, a quiet connection that needed no explanation. And Rex leaned closer, his eyes fixed on the envelope. As if he had been waiting for this exact moment since the beginning, and Caleb turned it over slowly in his hands, noticing the careful handwriting on the front, his name written in a way that felt both unfamiliar and deeply personal, and for a second, he simply held it there, feeling the weight of something that had traveled through time to reach him, and outside, the last of the wind faded into stillness, the storm finally gone, leaving behind a silence that no longer felt heavy, but whole. As if something that had once been unfinished had finally found its way back to where it belonged. Caleb did not open the envelope right away, his hands holding it with a quiet stillness as if he understood that whatever was inside carried more than words, it carried years, choices, and a connection that had traveled farther than either of them had realized, and the fire continued its soft rhythm beside them, the light shifting gently across the worn wood of the cabin, across Eleanor's calm expression, across Rex's steady gaze that had not left Caleb's hands since the envelope appeared, and for a moment, time seemed to stretch, not forward, not back, but inward, gathering everything into this single point, and Caleb finally slid a finger beneath the edge, opening it carefully, not tearing, not rushing, just allowing it to unfold the way it was meant to, and inside was a single sheet of paper, folded neatly, its surface aged but intact, the ink still clear, as if it had been written with the intention of lasting long enough to be found, and Caleb drew it out slowly, his eyes scanning the first lines, and as he began to read, something in his posture shifted, not visibly at first, but in the way his shoulders settled, the way his breath deepened, as if the words were reaching places inside him he had not visited in years, and Eleanor watched him without speaking, her hands resting quietly in her lap now, her purpose fulfilled not in action, but in arrival, and Rex leaned slightly closer, his head tilting just enough to follow Caleb's subtle movements, his presence constant, grounded, like an anchor in a moment that might otherwise drift too far into memory, and Caleb's eyes moved steadily across the page, the handwriting unfamiliar but the voice unmistakable, not because he recognized it, but because he understood it, the kind of voice that carried honesty without decoration, gratitude without expectation, and he paused for a second midway through, his thumb pressing lightly against the edge of the paper as if to hold the moment in place, and a faint breath escaped him, almost soundless, yet filled with something deeper than surprise, something closer to recognition of meaning rather than detail, and then he continued, finishing the letter in silence, letting the final words settle into him fully before lowering the page slightly, his gaze lingering there. As if the space between the lines held just as much as the words themselves, and outside, the light had begun to shift, the pale gray of the storm giving way to a softer brightness that reflected off the snow, filling the cabin with a quiet glow that felt less like daylight and more like clarity, and Caleb looked up slowly, his eyes moving to Eleanor, no longer uncertain, no longer searching, but carrying a quiet understanding that needed no explanation, and he gave a small nod, not as an answer, but as an acknowledgement of something that had finally come full circle, and Eleanor returned the gesture with a gentle expression, her eyes calm, her presence steady, as if she had always known this moment would arrive exactly like this, without noise, without urgency, just truth finding its place, and Rex let out a soft breath, lowering his head slightly, his body relaxing for the first time since they had entered the forest, as if whatever he had sensed from the beginning had now been resolved, and Caleb folded the letter carefully, placing it back into the envelope with the same care he had used to open it, not because it needed protection, but because it deserved respect, and he rested it beside him on the table, his hand lingering there for a moment longer than necessary, as if he were grounding the past into the present, and the room grew quiet again, not empty, but complete, the kind of silence that does not ask for more, only allows what is already there to be fully seen, and Caleb leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze drifting toward the window, where the snow now lay still and untouched, a clean expanse stretching beyond the trees, and for the first time in a long while, he did not feel the weight of isolation pressing against him, because something had shifted, something quiet but undeniable, and in that stillness, it became clear that some stories do not end when they are forgotten, they simply wait for the right moment to be remembered. The light outside had softened into a quiet afternoon glow, the kind that settles gently over the snow and makes the world feel less like a place of survival and more like a place of reflection, and inside the cabin, that same stillness had begun to take root, not as silence, but as something fuller, something that held meaning without needing to speak it aloud, and Caleb remained seated for a while longer, his eyes resting on the envelope beside him, not with hesitation, but with a quiet respect for what it represented, a bridge between a moment he had once walked away from and the life that had followed, and Rex had finally lowered himself onto the floor, his body relaxed now, though his eyes still followed Caleb with that same steady awareness, as if even in calm, he remained attuned to the deeper rhythm of things, and Eleanor watched them both with a softness that had replaced the strain of earlier, her breathing now even, her presence grounded, as though the journey that had carried her through years had finally reached a place where it could rest, and after a while, Caleb stood slowly, the movement unhurried, as if he were stepping into something rather than away from it, and he walked toward a small wooden cabinet near the far wall, opening it carefully, revealing a simple box inside, worn at the edges, the kind of object that had been kept not for its value, but for what it held, and he brought it back to the table, setting it down with a quiet certainty, and Eleanor's eyes followed the motion, not with surprise, but with a calm understanding that suggested she had expected this moment to come, and Caleb opened the box, revealing a few small items inside, nothing ornate, nothing that would draw attention from the outside world, but each piece carrying its own quiet history, and among them, he reached for a single metal tag, its surface dulled with time, its edges softened by years of being held and carried, and he placed it gently on the table between them, the faint light catching its engraved letters, and Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her breath slowing as she looked at it, her eyes tracing the name, the numbers, the identity that had once belonged to someone who had stood between life and silence, and she closed her eyes for just a moment, not in grief, but in recognition, as if the distance between past and present had finally folded into one, and when she opened them again, there was a quiet warmth there, something that had not been present before, something that felt like peace, and Caleb rested his hand lightly beside the tag, not claiming it, not presenting it, simply allowing it to exist in the space between them, and Rex lifted his head slightly, his gaze moving from the tag to Eleanor, then back to Caleb, as if acknowledging that the final pieces had come together, and outside, the last of the clouds had begun to drift apart, revealing a pale sky that stretched wide and open, untouched by the storm that had passed through it, and the light that entered the cabin now felt different, clearer, as if it carried with it a sense of completion, and Eleanor exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxing in a way that suggested she had been holding more than just the weight of the journey, and she reached into her coat once more, her movements steady, and this time she brought out a small set of keys, their metal faintly catching the light, and she placed them gently beside the tag, her hand lingering there for a second before pulling back, and Caleb looked at them without speaking, understanding arriving not as a surprise, but as something that had been building from the moment Rex first stepped into the snow, and Eleanor met his gaze, her voice soft but clear. "He wanted you to have a place," she said, and the words settled into the room with a quiet finality, not as an ending, but as a beginning that had been waiting for its moment. And Caleb did not reach for the keys right away, not because he doubted them, but because he understood that what they represented was more than ownership, more than inheritance, it was a continuation, a way of carrying forward something that had started long before this day, and Rex stood slowly, stepping closer, his presence steady, grounding, as if reminding Caleb that some paths are not chosen in a single moment, they are revealed step by step, and Caleb finally let out a slow breath, his eyes moving once more between the letter, the tag, and the keys, and in that quiet space, it became clear that what had begun as a simple act of survival in the snow had unfolded into something far greater, something that connected lives across time in ways that could not be planned, only discovered. Caleb remained still for a long moment after the keys touched the table, the quiet sound of metal against wood lingering in the air as if it carried more weight than the object itself, and his eyes rested on them not with hesitation, but with a kind of careful understanding, the kind that does not rush forward but instead allows meaning to settle fully before it is accepted, and Rex stood beside him, close enough that Caleb could feel the steady warmth of the dog's presence against his leg, grounding him in a way that no thought ever could, and Eleanor leaned back slightly, her strength returning not in sudden bursts but in quiet, steady breaths, her gaze soft as she watched him, not expecting anything, not asking, simply witnessing the moment unfold as it was meant to, and outside, the light had shifted again, the pale sky now stretching wide above the snow-covered forest, the storm nothing more than a memory carried in the shape of the drifts, and Caleb finally reached forward. Not quickly, not with urgency, but with a calm that came from knowing this was not a decision made in a single moment, but one that had been building across years, across choices he had made without knowing where they would lead, and his fingers closed gently around the keys, the metal cool against his skin, real, solid, undeniable, and he lifted them slightly, the faint sound they made quiet but clear, as if marking a turning point that did not need words to be understood, and he looked at Eleanor, his expression no longer guarded, no longer distant, but open in a way that felt new even to him, and she gave a small nod, her eyes carrying a quiet warmth that spoke not of loss, but of something completed, something fulfilled, and Caleb let out a slow breath, his shoulders easing as if a weight he had carried without noticing had finally been set down, and he placed the keys carefully into his coat pocket, not as a claim, but as an acceptance of something that had found its way to him for a reason, and Rex's tail moved once, slow and steady, his body relaxing further as if he too understood that the path they had followed had reached its end, or perhaps its beginning, and Caleb turned slightly, his gaze moving toward the window, where the forest stood still and quiet beneath the soft light, and for the first time in a long while, the silence did not feel like something to endure, but something to live within, and he stepped toward the door, opening it slowly, the cold air brushing against his face, sharp but clean, and Rex moved beside him without being called, his ears lifting as he took in the world outside, no longer tense, no longer searching, simply present, and Caleb stepped out onto the snow, his boots pressing into the fresh surface, leaving clear marks behind him, and he paused there for a moment, looking out across the trees, the light reflecting off the snow in a way that made everything feel brighter, wider, and somehow closer, and he did not feel alone, not in the way he once had, because something had shifted, something quiet but lasting, and behind him, the cabin door remained open, a small line of warmth spilling into the cold, and inside, Eleanor rested, no longer searching, no longer carrying the weight of a journey that had taken years to complete, and Caleb lowered his gaze slightly, his hand brushing against the pocket where the keys now rested, a simple gesture, yet filled with meaning, and Rex stepped forward into the snow, his paws moving with a calm confidence, not leading now, but walking beside, and Caleb followed, not toward anything urgent, not toward something unknown, but into a future that no longer felt empty, because sometimes, the smallest acts of kindness do not disappear into the world, they find their way back, quietly, patiently, until the moment comes when they are needed most, and in that stillness, beneath the open sky, Caleb understood that he had not been found by chance, he had been found because he had once chosen to stay, and that choice had never truly ended.